Well, I did that video that one time and y'all all fell asleep watching it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to attempt this again. And this time I'm gonna strip out the nitty-gritty details. We are just gonna, try and make things as simple as possible. Hopefully this video will be shorter and less snore-inducing. So this is take 2 of getting shallow depth of field with small sensor cameras.
This is 0612 TV.
Welcome aboard.
Hello YouTube and welcome to another photography tutorial on 0612 TV. Now, one of the questions I get asked very often is, how do I get that nice portrait effect using my Nikon Coolpix P500? Now, for those of you who are not aware, I did a pretty extensive series on the Nikon Coolpix P500, which is a bridge camera with a small sensor. Achieving that effect is naturally quite difficult, and normally the reason I provide is, well, because the sensor is small, so it's hard to get a shallow depth of field effect. Now, without some understanding of the theory, you won't be able to see why this is cause and effect, and instead of actually trying to explain that theory to you, because I did that last time and it didn't work out, I'm gonna just jump into the 3 different ways in which you can get better depth of field. Along the way, as I'm explaining this, I will try to touch on the theory just a little bit so you can get a broader understanding. But at the moment, here's all I need you to know. You will have less difficulty getting that effect if your camera has a large sensor. What this means is if you have a DSLR that's full frame or APS-C, this should be a pretty easy effect to pull off. Conversely, if you have a camera like mine, the Nikon Coolpix P500 with a tiny sensor, you're gonna have quite a lot more problems. So let's move on to actually take a look at the 3 different ways in which we can enhance the shallow depth of field effect. First, zoom in. The more you're zoomed in, the more prominent the shallow depth of field effect will be. You can actually see this in this set of images. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm using different levels of zoom, but I'm also moving my camera so that the subject actually stays the same size in frame. Of course, the background is different because that's what zoom does. But notice that for the case where I'm actually close to the subject and zoomed all the way out, you don't see a whole lot of that particular effect. Conversely, as I move back and as I zoom in, notice that the foreground actually stays the same, but the background is blurred. This is in fact the reason why a larger sensor camera actually has a better time capturing shallow depth of field. You see, the larger the sensor, the more you can see at once. If you have a smaller sensor, obviously your range of vision is going to be more restricted. So what's going to happen is for a large sensor camera and a small sensor camera, to actually frame a subject similarly, chances are you're going to have to actually zoom in on a large sensor camera. Whereas for the small sensor camera, you don't really need to because the field of view is already so restricted. As per this particular rule, the camera that is zoomed in more will produce more depth of field. And as such, that's why people say larger sensor cameras produce more depth of field, which isn't directly the correlation, but now you know why, you just have to zoom in more. Okay, let us move on to method number 2. Now, this particular method is called separation. It is stated simply as such. The greater the separation between the foreground and the background, the more prominent the shallow depth of field effect is going to be. Here's why. Now, take a look at this particular gradient. Let us say that white represents in focus and black represents out of focus. So normally when you try to focus on something, you'll imagine that, the focus looks something like this. It is clear at a certain part, and then eventually it starts blurring out because those stuff gets out of focus. So if the camera is here and the object you want to focus on is here, what's going to happen is if you have a shallow depth of field, you will imagine that the pattern looks something like this. Only this little bit in the center is actually in focus and it falls out of focus rapidly. Conversely, if you have a deep depth of field, what this means is you can get a lot of things in focus, and as a result, the gradient actually looks something like this. There's a lot of white and the actual focus only starts falling off after a good distance away. The reason why I'm actually showing you this particular style of diagrams is to actually explain the concept of separation. When you're actually trying to create a shallow depth of field, What you're trying to do is you're trying to pack the white region to as small an area as possible. So let's say now your foreground is indicated by this red line and the background is indicated by this blue line. What's going to happen is if you pack these two close together, obviously they're going to fall within the actual focal range of the camera. Conversely, if you actually move these two things apart, what's going to happen is since you have a shallow depth of field, there is no way you can capture both in the focal range of your camera. Obviously, things don't work this way if you have a deep depth of field, but that's exactly not what we're going to do today. We're actually trying to make the depth of field as shallow as possible. And that is why we must actually take advantage of the concept of separation. By keeping the foreground and background extremely far apart, you guarantee that focusing on one means you don't focus on the other. And as a result, the background blurring effect will become stronger. We move on to the third and last method, which is to actually tweak the aperture of your camera. Now, for those of you who don't know, basically the way your camera works is there is a sensor. In front of the sensor, there's actually an aperture, which is an opening that can, have a different range of sizes, and then the lens. Obviously, the first and most important job of the aperture is to control the amount of light hitting the sensor. When the aperture goes small, obviously less light hits the sensor, and conversely, when the aperture goes large, more light hits the sensor. So really, its job as an exposure control mechanism is very simple, but what we're more interested in seeing is its effect on the depth of field of the captured image. Now, in fact, there is a very easy way to remember how this works. You see, if I'm using a small aperture, it kind of acts like a pinhole camera. In doing so, what it's actually doing is it's helping to focus the light. As a result, when your aperture is small, you get a deeper depth of field. In other words, less blurring. So what you're gonna need to do if you like a lot of background blur is to actually open the aperture wide. When you do so, what's going to happen is you allow light to scatter, and as a result, blurring is more likely to happen. And there you have it. These are the three things you need to do if you want to get the shallow depth of field effect, and works whether you have a large or small sensor camera. Of course, it's probably the only way you can get things to work on a small sensor camera, and you can also apply these to larger sensor cameras to enhance the depth of field effect. Anyway, let us quickly recap. First, you want to zoom in as much as possible. Second, you want to ensure as much separation between the foreground and the background as you can. And finally, you want to open your aperture wide. These three effects combined will actually help create a very nice shallow depth of field effect. Anyway, that's all there is for this particular video. If you have any comments, queries or suggestions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Don't forget to check out the official Twitter for this channel at twitter.com/0612TV. As always, appreciate every like, favorite and subscription you give me. But until next time, you're watching 0612TV.